All right, let's see if we can make sense of most of these slides. Some of them I'm just going to skip over. You can just expect that information to be covered in some of the other videos that are posted on Blackboard. But we'll start right here with this map. I feel like the first thing to point out is that there are almost two different Renaissances happening in Europe at the exact same time. There's the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance. Now, the Italian Renaissance is everything that happens in this area. Everything that happens south of the Alps in the Italian peninsula and in all the neighboring islands, that is the Italian Renaissance. Everything north of there, everything out here is the Northern Renaissance. Now, in a lot of ways they look similar, but there are some specific differences, and I'll talk about that probably in the next slideshow presentation. Now, you'll see that Italy is still divided into duchies and republics and kingdoms. There's still the remaining elements of feudalism involved here, but the two that we're most interested in here are the Papal States, which is this green one here, and that is the land that belongs directly and specifically to the Pope himself. And then there's this blue one that neighbors that one, which is the Republic of Florence. Now, the Republic of Florence is essentially owned by the Medici family, which is the family that I kept mentioning when we were discussing that timeline in that first video. They're involved in everything. Now, be sure to look into the relationship between these two people, Lorenzo Ghiberti and Filippo Brunelleschi. It's a very long backstory, but I think you get the gist of it in Da Vinci's Engineering and Empire video that's posted on Blackboard. Now, one thing that is most specifically noteworthy here is this particular work that you're looking at right here, which is referred to as the Gates of Paradise. The Gates of Paradise are acknowledged as being the first official piece of artwork of the Renaissance. I don't know who gave it that title, but I have been told that over and over again by very smart people, that the Gates of Paradise by Lorenzo Ghiberti is the first official piece of artwork of the Renaissance. This is the work that all the sculptors that followed Lorenzo Ghiberti would come to study to figure out how to do shallow relief. It said that Michelangelo himself, much later on, would come and study the approaches and the techniques that Lorenzo Ghiberti used when he was developing his own sculptural practice. Notice these things are they're 15 feet tall. They're massive doors. Funded by Guild of Wool Merchants, that was led predominantly by, guess who? Cosimo de' Medici of the Medici family. It was a situation where the Catholic Church has a baptistry, because you're not supposed to step foot in the church unless you have been cleansed of all of your street sins and you've been baptized. So they have a baptistry directly in front of the church. There are two sets of doors on the baptistry that needed to have been redone, and this Guild of Wool Merchants decided that they would create a very fortuitous situation in which they would be able to put up a lot of money and get some notoriety for their guild. They would be able to pay the possibly living wages of a couple of artists for a period of a few years to get this project done, and the city of Florence gets new doors. It's a win-win-win. Doesn't quite go that smoothly. You'll hear about that when in the video where they discuss Lorenzo Ghiberti and Filippo Brunelleschi's relationship. But just know that Lorenzo Ghiberti ultimately won the commission, and he spent 27 years of his life finishing the commissions on these two sets of baptistry doors. Now, that being said, he won this commission, but oh yeah, and here's a detail of one of those panels. It's like each one of these is a tale of morality from the Bible. It's a specific book visually represented. It's a specific major story. That's what you're seeing here. And you see it's very impressive, the level of detail, the illusion of depth that he's able to convey here. But anyway, Lorenzo Ghiberti won that battle, but I would say that Filippo Brunelleschi won the war. And Filippo Brunelleschi was largely responsible for finishing the dome on the Florence Cathedral, or the Cathedral de Santa Maria del Fiore. If you go to Italy then and ask to see that, they'll probably direct you to a building that they'll refer to as Il Duomo, which means the dome or the domed cathedral. Italian is one of those languages. I don't speak it, but the more I learn about it, the less magical and musical it seems, and the more it seems like one of those mobster movies from the 60s and 70s where everybody's got a ridiculous nickname that is borderline insulting, we'll get back into that a little bit later. But this is the Florence Cathedral. This is the dome that Filippo Brunelleschi is responsible for. Well, this is the baptistry directly in front of this particular cathedral, and the two sets of doors on the baptistry are the gates of paradise, the ones that Lorenzo Ghiberti finished. So Lorenzo Ghiberti gets the doors, which even though are massive, is a very small thing compared to finishing this 376 foot tall. It's a very massive structure. None of the pictures that you can find of this thing really do it justice. It's a huge, huge building. It dwarfs everything else in Florence. It's a very impressive undertaking architecturally. But anyway, watch the video. Find out a lot more about that. Now, Filippo Brunelleschi also constructed this. It's the Church of San Lorenzo. Lorenzo is Lorenzo Ghiberti. I mean, God, Lorenzo de' Medici of the Medici family, or Lorenzo the Magnificent. So this is built as a private chapel for the Medici family. Now, I would like to ask you what style of architecture this is, because we were just looking at some really, really impressive examples of Gothic architecture, and there's really high pointed vaults, and how thin and luminous everything was. There are definitely elements of that here, but the trend that seems to be much more prominent is Romanesque. This is Romanesque architecture. It's arches and columns and domes. Corinthian columns with arches mounted on top, and ultimately leads to a massive dome structure here. Yeah, this is referred to as Renaissance architecture, but I pretty much insist that Renaissance architecture is just Romanesque architecture in a new, slightly improved iteration. So yeah, the reason why, I referred to this back in the first video, things that were Roman all of a sudden are what's fashionable. Nobody cared. There are actually churches that came up with these fake sleeves that would go over their Gothic columns to make them look more Romanesque, to make them look like these Corinthian or Ionic columns, something that referred a lot more directly to the Roman culture, because that's what everybody wanted all of a sudden. You know, trends shift. So, Palazzo de' Medici Riccardi, this is the private household of the Medici family. And it doesn't look all that impressive, especially considering the amount of wealth and power that the Medici family had, and it wasn't an accident. This building looks like it could be like a book repository or a warehouse or something like that. It's a really nice warehouse, I'll give you that. But considering the era that this was built in and what it is that the Medici family could have afforded, I mean, they really could have built castles on top of castles on top of castles, and then still had more money than they would have possibly known what to do with. But they decided that they were going to buy out this it was a complex of apartments. There were 20 separate apartments, and they bought this whole building and began to use it as their private household. They also operated their business from this household, but they specifically wanted something that didn't look all that austere and presumptuous, because they knew that everybody was watching them, and if they walked around throwing their money all over the place, then they would lose the respect of the people, and people wouldn't be able to trust them with the well-being of Florence, you know, as a republic. That was their responsibility. So, oh, you know, these there are these archways on the ground level that have been filled in, and there are windows. Michelangelo Buonarroti himself actually is responsible for installing these windows. Originally, this would have been an open archway that would have gone right into the courtyard, which we're about to see. Now, before we do that, though, let me point out there's one specific term. These stones on the bottom level of this building here are referred to as rusticated stone. And rusticated means that they are rough and unfinished. They haven't been polished smooth, and they're not face stones. These are, again, to reinforce the fact that, well, you know, we have a lot of money, but we don't need to spend all that money on nice-looking stones, even though if you look at the second and then the third level, by the time you get to the third floor of this building, then you're dealing with some pretty fancy stonework there. But you're still at least presenting the illusion that they're humble and that they're being really conscious of how that money is being spent. I should also point out that this building, even though it's 3 floors, that building's at least 60 feet, probably 65 feet tall. You can see there's a person standing next to a car over here as a reference to scale. So even though it doesn't look like much, and it's really not in comparison to what they could have done, it's still an impressive structure. That leads us directly to the inside of this thing. because once you're inside of the Palazzo de' Medici Riccardi, you're actually doing business with the Medici family. From the outside, they can look humble, but when you make it inside of the building, they want you to know that they are someone to be respected. They got this way by being smart and shrewd businessmen, and they're not going to be taken advantage of. And this is where they sort of show off that money, the resources that they have available. All right, we'll skip that one. We'll talk briefly about this one. Donatello is the first Ninja Turtle that we have referenced here, and he predates the other ones by a very significant period of time. So I think it's just an interesting choice. But anyway, this particular sculpture is a sculpture of David. Now, the David was seen as the icon of the Medici family because they're this one small family, and they see themselves as taking on the entire rest of the world. Which in some cases was true, in some cases not so much. Donatello, a controversial figure in his time because he's seen as being fairly hot-headed. There are rumors about his religious affiliations, about his sexual affiliations. A lot of that has to do with the way that this particular sculpture was constructed. Now, I'll ask you, when was the last time or last culture that we saw create a nude figure in its artwork? And that would be going all the way back to the Roman period. This was commissioned specifically by the Medici family through Donatello. If it was not for that specific fact, then this probably wouldn't exist, because if this was under the control or the authority of the church, it never would have happened, because the church was still highly opposed to anything even remotely this close to nudity. So this would have been something that would have gotten Donatello into a whole lot of trouble. So this was built specifically for the Medici family. Now, we do have nudity, which is already controversial, but then it always bothered me that this this David figure took off all of his armor, but he's wearing a hat and socks. And I found out a few years ago that's because this is actually a reference to Hermes, which makes this a paganism. You're blurring some really dangerous lines here in the 1450s if you blend Christianity with paganism in one single piece of artwork. That could easily be considered heresy. The church, again, would not have appreciated that whatsoever. But this is the first of a few. We're going to see at least 3 David sculptures. This is the first one. It's a life-sized, 5'2" figure, cast in bronze. This is what's referred to as Donatello's victorious David. He's already killed Goliath, and this is the head of Goliath, resting at his feet. Something I've always found interesting about this particular story is how underrated slingers were in their heyday. Goliath being hit in the head with that stone is essentially, it's the same force as someone being shot in the head by a much smaller bullet today. Look into that. It's a really interesting story when you consider the actual power that was given to someone who had a sling with some accuracy. Anyway, let's move forward. Now, more to the point is what we're looking at here. This is labeled here, it says Renaissance perspective systems. I'm going to refer to this as linear perspective. Now, linear perspective is also referred to as scientific perspective or mathematical perspective, but I like linear perspective better because it's a little bit more descriptive. Linear perspective essentially rotates around the idea that all of these random lines that you see being generated from this one vanishing point are called orthogonals. And these orthogonals create the illusion that everything that exists within these 2 reference points, within these 2 orthogonals, are the same height as they recede. So you can tell that even though these 2 figures back here are much, much smaller than the figures in the foreground, in reference to the orthogonals, or their proportions in reference to the orthogonals, is much the same as what you would find as someone up here, because they're roughly the same height. Perspective becomes really valuable during the Renaissance because natural observation all of a sudden comes back into cultural prevalence. And this is something that you can also trace back to humanism and all of a sudden people feeling safe investigating the natural world around them.